really excited to be here, to be starting another series. So today we're delighted to have with us Tom Atlee, who's going to present, as JD had mentioned, and he's going to talk about the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole. Now, Tom is a former peace activist, and he's also the founder of the nonprofit Co-Intelligence Institute that explores what intelligence looks like when it takes wholeness, interconnectedness, and co-creativity together into one piece. He's had this activist orientation, but he feels the philosophical co-intelligence worldview has its most important application in what he calls, quote, wise democracy, where wisdom involves attending to what serves long-term broad benefit. He's written 4 books. I'm only going to mention 1 or 2 of them: The Tao of Democracy and Reflections on Evolution, on Evolutional Activism, Essays, Poems, and Prayers for an Emerging Field of Sacred Social Change. He's done hundreds of different articles. He lives a simple life in Eugene, Oregon, at a co-op. He's concerned with existential risks and gives almost all his work supported to his organization, Co-Intelligence Institute. With no further ado, let's bring on Tom. Tom, please get started. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gail. First, I want to note that I'm here largely because JD and I were on the 1986 cross-country Great Peace March together. And in that 9-month mobile community, there was no one in charge. It has a whole story behind it. But in that experience, I had my first vivid experiences of self-organization and collective intelligence. It changed my life and launched my more than 35 years of research, analysis, and vision building in what I call co-intelligence. So, hi, JD. That was quite a time together. Sometime maybe we'll talk about that. To introduce myself, I'd like to share my 3 main identities. First of all, I'm an independent, non-academic scholar. I'm a possibility addict, and I'm an evolutionary activist. So for 35 years, I felt deeply called to explore the potentials of wholeness in all its dimensions and variants. In doing that, I collect, curate, and integrate other people's views about wholes and wholeness, and then apply what I learned to the possibility of generating collective wisdom in a wise democracy. That's the idea of a wise democracy is a very, very real possibility that I'm now very much addicted to. So in this talk, I'll be sharing a lot of what I've gathered on more or less woven into one of many of the models I've developed over the years. And this is only one view of the territory, but I hope it will make sense for you. I decided to start with a little thought stretcher I've never done before. Just came up with it this morning. So you are now part of the evolution of my explorations. This will be a kind of guided meditation to get a taste of what one whole that's called IRAS through one dimension of IRAS, which is all the people in it. So there's many dimensions to any whole, and all the parts is one of those dimensions. So we're going to try out looking at IRAS through that view. So I want to start with you. Consider yourself. Sense into the fullness of who you are and what you could be under the right circumstances. Consider your experience, all your experiences and knowledge. Sense into your capacities, the things you have done and can do, and how you engage with the world at your best. Sense into your resources, your time, your money, your connections, all the things you have that you could possibly offer to benefit what you love and value. And sense into your unique connections to the world and to the cosmos. So sort of take a minute to sort of sense into all that for you. The fullness of who you are and what gifts you have. And now recognize that everyone on this call has their own version of that personal fullness. Sense into the way bigger fullness of who we all are and could be. Our collective experience, our knowledge, our capacities, our resources, how all that adds up, how big it is, just with the dozens of people who are on this call. We could extend that, imagining how that incredible reality would grow if we included everyone in IRAS, not just the people on this call. Think of how much all of us are and have to offer under the right circumstances. Of course, the fact that we have it now, we have that potential now, doesn't mean that potential would be realized, but just sense into the immense texture, fabric of that. And we can expand that fabric and go even further. Imagine all the networks that we all have, the relationships spreading and overlapping, embracing thousands upon thousands of people collectively. We won't even go into the networks that those people have, but just look at the networks that we have. Each of us probably knows dozens, if not hundreds, some of us maybe thousands of people. We could reach those people if we needed to. And note that this is just our static potential, just who we are and what we have. We could multiply that many times over if we considered potential synergies among us all. Might we all be more, any two or three of us combined in the right way? What would that generate? To say nothing of all of us. What kinds of wisdom and action and benefits could come out of that, theoretically, if we manage to engage in the right kinds of juicy, productive interactions, dialogues, and collaborations. Now, that's just a taste for IRAS, the sense of the potential. We're all separate parts, but there's a way in which there's potential for engagement, circumstances, whatever, out of which we could be way more than we are right now. And I am addicted to that kind of thing. We've tasted it for IRAS for a few moments. And imagine all the vibrant wholeness that could be expanded even further if we pursued questions like, what could IRAS also be? There's a process called World Cafe that is brilliant at creating questions for people to pursue. And that's one of their favorite questions is, what could X also be? What could IRAS also be? But for me, the big question is, what could democracy also be? You know, I want to extend that kind of sense of potential for whole communities, societies, issues, the whole civilization, the world. You know, it's like, what could we call forth? How could we call forth the latent wisdom and resourcefulness of all those wholes? So in my talk, I'll be sharing with you some of the ways I think about that. Now I'm going to dig out my slides to share with you. Let's see. Here we go. The wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole. What is it? Why focus on it? So we have the whole, wholes, wholeness. What do these have to offer to us? Let's see if I can get this out. Okay. Three things I can see. One is big picture understanding. If we are looking at the whole, trying to understand the whole, we kind of get grounded cognitively in what's more of what's actually there to know what's needed. If we are only dealing in parts and partiality and partisanship, we're only getting part of the picture. And to be able to have big picture understanding grounds us in a greater amount of reality. And then there's another, which is practical, this was practical grounding, like big picture inclusive engagement. Who and what are all the people, forces, perspectives who are involved in this, whatever it is that we're looking at. To the extent we can engage all those entities in what's going on. And you think, again, I'm sort of coming from a wise democracy perspective. We're thinking about democracy, our collective decision-making, our collective action, our collective policies. You know, if we actually include all those involved, we are going to align them with getting things done through them all. They will all be more fit with what we want to accomplish together. And the third one is moral grounding. If we can think in terms of broad, inclusive benefit, who should benefit from whatever we come up with, whatever we do? And that can be people, and usually people are thinking in terms of people, but includes the larger world. It includes all the living beings, all the living systems, the planet itself, future generations, past, the ancestors. It's like, who would benefit from what we do? And that's a way to have moral grounding in wholeness. And I say healthy, holy, regenerative outcomes with minimal resistance. Because if everybody's benefiting, you're not going to get a lot of resistance. So let's take this thing apart. We have wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole. So what do we mean by the whole? Well, I'm just seeing, I have good. Getting rid of some of the pictures that are blocking my ability to see my whole slide here. So one way to look at the whole is nature, the biosphere. Another is deep time story, deep into the past, deep into the future. I have a colleague, Michael Dowd, who's very much in IRAS's worldview of combining science, finding the sweet spot between science and spirituality and religion. And he talks about evolution, the science-based story of evolution, as our creation story. And he wrote a book called Thank God for Evolution, former Christian preacher. Spirit, God, there's a whole realm of the whole there, that has wisdom and resourcefulness in it, which many of the more spiritual people in this group would be familiar with. The full nature of each of us, each being, each person, each life form. There is that of God in every man. I came from a Quaker background, and that was one of them. There's that of God in every person was one of their things. All our modes of knowing, reason, rationality, facts, all that linear stuff is a very powerful mode of knowing, but so is intuition. So are all the multiple intelligence, emotional intelligence, street smarts. There's all these different ways of knowing what different domains of what's going on. And there, all of life is in nested living systems, holonic systems. A holon is a part that is a whole that is a part. Every whole is part of other wholes, and every whole is a part of other wholes. So it's like that whole that is a part is called a holon. So they're all nested into each other, and that is a whole to be consulted and engaged. And quantum non-dual reality, non-dual consciousness at a consciousness level, and quantum non-localness is a scientific version of that. The sense that there's a wholeness. It's even more than interconnectedness. It's a wholeness. It's a no divisionness that exists in reality, and that can be seen as a whole. Again, filled with wisdom and resourcefulness. At the more human level, which is where I mostly do my work, I think in terms of the whole group or organization, like the little exercise that we did, the whole community, a town, a city, whatever, the whole network, do work with helping whole networks find out what their wisdom and resourcefulness is, whole state, whole country. So that's in terms of human groups, whole range of diversity. There's a funny way in which you don't have to have everyone and everything. If you pick some entities that represent each of the different populations in it's like what the the idea of microcosm is to build a smaller entity that is represents a larger entity, particularly when it includes the whole range of diversity. When public opinion pollsters select who they're going to be asking their poll questions to, they create a microcosm of randomly selected but filtered for different kinds of demographics. So you end up with 1,000 people that represent the whole in some major way. And that's very similar to what is done when they do what's called mini publics, which is like a jury, except on public policy. And some of them have a dozen or 2 dozen people in it. Some of them have, hundreds of people in them, different sizes, but they're a group of citizens selected at random with a filter for demographics to be able to have a whole range of diversity, to embody the larger community. You're going to help them deliberate together, talk together, come up with things together that are then shared with the larger world. This word holopticism, it's a takeoff on panopticism, which is the power center is able to see everybody through various kinds of surveillance. Holopticism is the ability of the whole to see the whole. So the ability, one particular example of a citizen council that I talk about was done by Maclean's magazine, the Time magazine of Canada, kind of, in 1991, where they picked 12 people scientifically to represent the diversity of Canada, and then provided, and they were supposed to come up with a vision for a country when the country was like really divided. And they provided such amazing coverage. All the individuals were covered really well with little bios, day by day, hour by hour, what happened in their deliberations and the success that they came up with, and their pictures of their body language, arms crossed at the beginning, and I should turn this thing off. Oops. And then at the end, everybody's hugging each other, and the sense of the whole country had a vicarious experience of that process. Very seldom is that done in that way. So the whole of the country had a chance to watch the whole of the country in microcosm talk to itself and come up with a vision, a shared vision for itself. The whole context is another way to frame the whole. You have, there's histories, there's physical contexts, there's what people come into. So being mindful that well, the whole context of what's happening in a situation or in a dialogue or a deliberation or anything, be aware of the whole context. And there, again, depending on how you design it, there is wisdom and resourcefulness can be extracted from that, generated by that. The whole situation can be all the players. The whole situation can be a full spectrum of perspectives. Whole situation can be a full spectrum of information, or all the relevant factors. These are all different windows or takes on what the whole is. And all of these are valid when we talk about the wisdom and resources of the whole. Any one or combination of these provides you with greater wisdom and greater resourcefulness if you design the inquiry or the activity, the interaction such that you can actually access that. So let's look at the wisdom aspect of this. And the general thing in my frame of reference for collective wisdom is being guided by what's needed for long-term broad benefit. We don't want short-term benefit. I mean, we do want short-term benefit, but the wisdom is in the long-term benefit and the broadness of the benefit, not narrow. And these are examples: deep time orientation. You're looking, for example, the 7th generation, making decisions with the 7th generation in mind. Partnership spirit, working with, helping people work with each other, helping people work with nature, the sense of we're all in it together, we're all creating it together. Inclusive caring, how big is your circle of care and concern? Extending that out is another source of wisdom. Systems thinking. Systems thinking for me is any rigorous way of tracking and assuming interconnectedness. Ecology is a scientific way of doing that. Shamanism is a spiritual way of doing that. Complexity and chaos theories are other ways of doing that. I should take a drink. Non-dual awareness. The sense that everything is one, we are one, the universe is one all the time. The apparency of separateness is an apparency. It's a useful apparency, but it's an apparency. So the more you can sense into the non-dual nature of reality, the more you can do this, get guided by long-term broad benefit. Multiple perspective view, which is related to big picture learning. Being able to hold multiple perspectives, the left and right, whatever, that's an archetypal sort of dichotomous view, but to be able to, if you're having an argument with somebody, being able to hold your own perspective and their perspective simultaneously. And if to the extent you can do that, to the extent you can, the capacitance is the capacity to hold things that are not comfortable together in a state of irresolution, because in that state of irresolution, you can, like having a question that you live into, that you always are gaining more insight by asking the question over and over again, rather than just trying to find a definitive answer, to be able to hold it. And generative dialogue means, for me in my world, is interactions that generate greater insight, greater relationship, or greater possibility. If you're having any kind of interaction, usually conversational, but not always, that generates greater understanding, greater possibility, greater relationships, that's a generative dialogue. And you need to be able to hold multiple perspectives in order to do that. And being able to do that serves being guided by what's needed for long-term broad benefit. Reflective listening. There's lots of interesting examples of processes that specialize in reflective listening so that people feel really heard. And when people feel really heard, they relax and open up, and the ability of them to hold other people's perspectives is vastly increased. And their ability to have a sort of curious humility about what can we discover here, rather than being stuck in whatever they walked in the room with. And all of that helps you lead to being able to see, bigger picture more and more. I have a only semi tongue-in-cheek joke about the most important thing to know about any situation is that there's more to it than that. That exists in every situation. Every situation, there's more to it. And if you really take it seriously and understand that there's always more to it, you will be open to exploring deeper and deeper and being able to generate a bigger and bigger picture of what's going on. And I say learning because not only are you learning your way into the bigger picture, the situation is changing as you go. So being able to recognize that wherever you happen to stand at a moment, wherever you get clarity, there's something next. A lot of science is based on that, in its ideal state anyway, is based on that kind of, get clarity, but don't get too certain, because that will stop you from being able to continue exploring. So these are all dynamics and capacities to help generate this kind of wisdom. And then we have resourcefulness. Okay, there are so many things. Very often I use synergy as the main example. Synergy is the usual definition of synergy is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So with an archetypal example of hydrogen and oxygen and water, hydrogen and oxygen are their own things at room temperature. They're gases. You put them together, and at room temperature, they become liquid. They become this water, which has all this other potential that oxygen and hydrogen don't. The idea, if you have four iron bars, what's the best way to put them together? Well, we put them together in a square. A square is actually pretty easy to knock down. If you put them together in a triangle, there are various ways to put four things together in a triangle that are very, very much stronger. And the fact that it's the same bars, the same iron bars, the synergy is something that's coming out of, it's an emergent property out of them. And they're sort of opposite of that, or the complement of that, is holergy, which is a coined word. I made up that word to describe how any part is greater than its role in any whole. So an example would be a student in a classroom. And the fact is, they are a whole in their own right. They have a whole pile of relationships. They have knowledge and experience. They have all sorts of stuff going on just with them. And if you are aware of that and tap that, the kid may have a parent who was involved in some activity that you're now studying as a classroom, and the parent could come in and help the learning happen. But the fact is, everybody, all the people that were in our original exercise about IRAS, all of those people, all of you and everybody else, has things about you that could be uncovered and tapped for the benefit of the larger whole. So these are just two examples: multimodal knowing, all the different ways of knowing we talked about; multimodal power, power over, power with. These are, power over is a controlling, managerial kind of power, and power with is a collaborative kind of power. Power from within, particularly the people who are more spiritual will relate to the power from within, but it can be any kind of inner power, not just spiritual presence, but knowledge or capacities that you have, and the power from among, the kinds of synergy, kinds of interactions that people have can generate power. So there's all these different kinds of power. We covered capacitance already, mindfulness, again, the spiritually oriented people, but many scientific people also, the sense of there's a kind of present consciousness that can generate resources. We're not saying resources here, although they're part of it. It's whole system abundance is looking at all the resources that exist in the system, but there's a resourcefulness, the ability to generate resources, vibrant networks, vision, your inspiration. You're actually inspired to bring things forth and create things. It's just attunement to something higher than yourself, a purpose, a larger supreme being. There's all kinds of attunement that can happen, alignment, agreement. We're all on the same page together. Multimodal capital is let's get a bigger whole than just money. Capital is something you can invest to get more of something, and money is clearly you can do that. But they also talk about social capital. It's like relationships. You can actually take relationships, if you have developed good, strong relationships, you can invest those relationships to generate more relationships, to generate money, whatever. You can also have natural capital, which is nature, all the different things about nature that you can actually use to get more of this, that, or the other. And there's a bunch of, there's intellectual capital, spiritual capital, is all sorts of different kinds of capital. Once we free ourselves of the trap of money is all there is, we can expand into many different kinds of capital. And if we actually had an economic system that was centered on multimodal capital, it would be generating a healed planet instead of a destroyed planet. Diverse capacities, everybody has different capacities, and we can bring all those capacities in the whole into play. Resilience, the ability to bounce back. So these are all things that are characteristics of the whole and your relationship to the whole. and the relationships of all the entities in the whole to each other. And I want to expand our sense of what's going on here by referral to this Daniel Schmachtenberger and Nate Hagens. If you want to take a note, you can just put this down and add AI. Daniel Schmachtenberger, Nate Hagens, and AI, and you will get a 3-hour-long thing, which is now my main focus. It's about systemic drivers underlying all the different crises we have, underlying the technology gone haywire, underlying the climate change, underlying injustice, underlying virtually every crisis that we have, and they're all merging into what some people are calling the polycrisis or meta-crisis into one gigantic crisis. And Daniel Schmachtenberger offers this analysis between narrow intelligence and broad wisdom. Narrow intelligence, the intelligence that sees in terms of parts and is of parts and serves exclusive short-term goals. It's like the left brain. It's really powerful at getting somewhere quickly, efficiently, whatever. And that dynamic, which is underlies all of these things, corporate goals, individual goals, national goals, human goals, as opposed to including nature kind of goals. That kind of intelligence, which has created this, on one hand, this great affluence and freedom and the rest that we have, is also undermining the larger well-being of the planet, long-term well-being. Broad wisdom serving inclusive long-term goals is the antidote to that. And that drives everything that's needed to heal and transform the world. So this is another way to highlight what is important about the whole and how it's associated with wisdom. And Schmachtenberger notes that as planetary limits are reached, wisdom must bound, guide, and constrain narrow intelligence. And yeah, leave it at that for now. And so the wise democracy vision has power, participation, and wisdom. These are three. When you talk about politics, it's always about power. You start getting democracy and you start to have participation. It's participation in power is largely what democracy is about. And I am adding wisdom. What kinds of outcomes? You can have mass participation that's empowered and have too much of the sort of mob consciousness or the ignorance of people or whatever coming out to generate folly, collective folly. So adding wisdom in, and to ask, instead of government of, by, and for the people, we go power of, by, and for the whole, participation of, by, and for the whole, wisdom of, by, and for the whole. In each case, the whole is generating it and benefiting by it. Generating the power, benefiting by the power, generating the participation, benefiting by it, generating the wisdom and benefiting by it. And that's an underlying model for what's going on in the wise democracy research. Okay, so what's about all this in leadership? Wisdom, resource on the whole calls us to a special kind of leadership that involves appreciating the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole. We need to appreciate it, both understanding it and valuing it, both of those definitions, and engaging with it in ways that enhance it, evoking the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole. There's an assumption here that the wisdom and resourcefulness of any whole exists in actual or potential form in the whole. So how do we call it forth? What is the know-how for that? to call forth the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole in all the kinds of dimensions that we were talking about, and engaging the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole. So once it is evoked, how do we get it into action? It may have all it needs. I mean, our evocation may have brought it into action, but if it's the wisdom is just engaged and the sort of sense of resourcefulness is there, okay, let's launch that. Let's get that rolling. So this is a different kind of leadership, and it's on behalf of the whole. So you're getting, appreciating, evoking, engaging the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. And you can do it from different kinds of whole. It's like we can get the whole community, the wisdom and resourcefulness, evoking the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole community on behalf of the whole biosphere. I mean, they can play it in different ways. You can have the wisdom and resourcefulness of the group on behalf of a whole individual. So there's different ways to apply it depending on which kind of whole you are choosing to work with. And that co-intelligent leadership we call the prime directive of wise democracy. I have design guidances called patterns. There's a whole 96 patterns and a pattern language for wise democracy on one of my websites. And underlying every single pattern is the prime directive. So it's a guidance for appreciating, evoking, and engaging the wisdom and resourcefulness whole on behalf of the whole. There's lots of know-how about how to do that. And I have been collecting that, curating it, lots of examples of each one of those patterns. And here's the Co-Intelligence Institute, which I wonder, I don't know if I click on this, whether it will take me to the Institute page. I think it's going to break it. So I'm going to stop the share and start it again to give you a quick tour of the Oh, there's something in the chat for me. Oh, it's not for me. A quick tour of some of the other Firefox. Yes, that's not the one I wanted to have first, but dimensions of wholeness. It's what you'll see behind me on the wall. There's a spiral map. This is one of my better models of wholeness, which has for any given holon, things go into making it up. They go into relationship. Each part has contributions. They interact together. They're integrated into a oneness, and that oneness has an interiority, and then it becomes part of, as a holon, it becomes part of another larger whole. So this and all of that is surrounded by context, which shapes what happens. So this is something that is on the Co-Intelligence Institute website that you can check out if you want. And just for the fun of it, this is another map of wholeness I have, which is just a total tangle. It's on Miro. Oops, which I'm not going to go into. But we lost it. Okay. So here are the patterns. wd-pl.com is the pattern language website for the wise democracy. So these are all patterns, design principles, guidances. If you want to create a wise democracy, you'd be able to get a lot of guidance from this. That's what they're for. If you want to do something else that's smaller than that, than making a wise democracy, these are also really useful, particularly if you want to generate collective wisdom in your group. And examples, multimodal intelligence, we covered that, multimodal knowing. we covered that. So this is what any one of those patterns that I showed you has a page. This is an example of a page. And it has a card. There's a whole card deck that goes with this, picture, head, heart, spirit kind of things. A little description, related patterns, questions for exploring the pattern. These are all different different resources and examples that can help you work with that pattern. A little talk about it here, and that talk is edited and expanded so that each page has a whole pile of materials on it. And I am try and do the other. Yeah, there's on that site, there is also an article on the sources of wisdom, diversity and quality dialogue. You have a bunch of diverse entities or ideas. You need to have some way to integrate them into deeper insight of some kind, deeper engagement. I have the left and right people coming together. There's all these bridging methodologies to bring them together. If you don't, the diversity will probably result in fragmentation. But if you have quality interactions, and there's a whole field of methodologies for doing that. So this is the number one source in my book, number one source for wisdom, generating wisdom. Holistic and system sciences, you saw some references to that. Spiritual wisdom traditions. Golden Rule is a great example. It shows up in practically every religious tradition in one form or another. Multiple intelligences, seeing deep in time and scale, very small scale, very large scale. We don't normally see deeply into time and scale. Okay. And truly inclusive approaches, including whatever you want to exclude is going to come back to haunt you. So better to include whatever you can tolerate. Healthy information ecosystems, we're seeing that being corroded in our democracies. Using disturbance creatively. So if you have a problem or a crisis or something, inside of that, like climate change, inside of climate change is information and energy about everything that we need to change to survive as a civilization. Rather than just trying to get rid of climate change, we should follow what it's trying to tell us. That's one of the main guidances for that. There's a pattern specifically about using diversity and disturbance creatively. Addressing cognitive limitations, confirmation bias, where we just pick up information that fits what we already know. The fact that we have cognitive systems that are tens of thousands of years old and everything around us has changed. There's all sorts of things to know about how to deal with our cognitive limitations to get around them. The energy of positive possibility, personal authenticity and wisdom. You get some wise people in your group. That's great, as long as people listen to them. Conscious learning and flexibility, attention to power dynamics. That leads us briefly to this article, which is also on the Wise Democracy website, Modes of Power. And it has power over, it's a whole pile of forms of power over. Consensual power over, where you delegate or mandate someone to have power over you, like we do in most democracies. Non-consensual power over, power against, where you're actually trying to defeat the opponent. As a power over strategy. Suasive power, nonviolent power, the power of love. There's a power over dimension to the power of love. If you can love bomb people enough when they're not ready for it, they can be, whoa, I am so loved, and shift. And then there's a whole pile of power from among, collective power family, power from among, power with, and then power from within. And then the power from without, which is various kinds of positive leadership kinds of stuff. And then the engaged, the disengaged, where you're not you're apathetic, supposedly. It's like those who didn't vote actually vote. They are actually part of creating whatever happens next. So if you want to delve into many, many different forms of power, there's stuff there. And in the cointelligence.institute site, there's a section on called writing up here in the drop downs. And it is a curated section of my essays from various sources: intelligence, wisdom, and co-intelligence, wholeness, complexity, and systems, process, participation, and evolution, power, politics, and governance, spirituality, consciousness, and morality, working with diversity and difference, and collective sense-making, cultivating wisdom and truth. So if you want to delve further into writings by me, there's those, and there's my books, A Tao of Democracy, Empowering Public Wisdom, Participatory Sustainability, and Reflections on Evolutionary Activism. This one's filled with poems too, if you like poetry. And I guess I will stop my share with that and turn it back over to Gail.
Thanks, Tom. That was really wonderful. Such a tour de force for a really interesting area. Now, JD had said that he wanted to sort of act as respondent, but also engage you in a little bit of discussion. So I'm going to invite JD to join us now and make some comments.
That was beautiful. You have managed to put together all these really great technologies and ways of thinking, practices for wisdom systems. You know, wisdom system thinking, creative listening, and active listening, and chaos theory. I mean, I love how you've packaged it all together in service of making better decisions, I think. And I wanted to ask you, I know in your Tao of Democracy book, there's a very concrete example of how one might apply some of these approaches. It had to do with Canada and secession of back when, and maybe this is still an issue, I don't know. When Quebec there was strife about whether Quebec should remain within part of Canada, and they had a citizens deliberative panel. Anyway, I'm wondering if you're willing to share that story as a concrete example of how this can work in the world.
Yes, I mentioned it briefly in the section on holopticism, or the ability of the whole to see the whole. We have all around the world, we have hundreds of examples of these citizens gathered together and being facilitated in good deliberation or dialogue and coming up with recommendations for what the community or society should do, usually for government, appointing government. And Maclean's was watching their country come apart. Maclean's was the Time magazine of Canada, and it was Quebec, as you said. Quebec was trying to secede, and the original peoples, the native peoples, were going, we're not just a minority. You're living on our land. It's like this is a different frame of reference. But the country as a whole, the different provinces were not well connected to each other. It was just a mess, and lots of efforts to have conversations had gone on. And Maclean's magazine decided to try something different. And
so this was not a government. This wasn't organized by the Canadian government. They just wanted to see what would happen if you get diverse representatives of the Canadian population in a room together.
So they didn't do random selection. They did a scientific. They had their polling firm scientifically pick 12 people who, among them, represented a wide diversity of different demographics, and they were all articulate kinds of people. So they gathered these people in a retreat center for a long weekend, Friday evening and Saturday and Sunday. And they hired Roger Fisher, who was from the Harvard Negotiation Project, who was a co-author of a book called Getting TS, which is a classic, a watershed book in the field of negotiation, how to get from you and me negotiating to get our individual interests met to getting both of us on the same side of the table working to satisfy our legitimate interests. There's a whole system of doing that. So he was hired with 2 other people from Harvard to come up and facilitate this. And what was remarkable was not the actual activity, because that has been, versions of that have been done all over the place. But the fact that Maclean's did 40 pages of coverage, it's like, when has a news weekly ever given 40 pages of coverage to anything? And the fact they did it as an experiment, sort of a fancy focus group, they didn't know what would happen. But they describes like 6 pages of, here's each person who was chosen, why they were chosen, who they are, what their life is like, and then they do this blow by blow account. It's like 12 or 15 pages of here's what the scene is on Saturday or Friday night. Here they're sitting around the circle. You see their body language and everything, and then so and so says this, so and so says that. Here's another picture of some more body language, and it's like they don't know quite what's going on. They don't know how this is going to come about, but they've been told to be authentic, so they are. And
at the end, these people with really, really opposing approaches at the beginning did come to some sort of consensus about it.
Yes, but I want to point out one thing in the middle of that is that by Saturday night, it had almost fallen apart. The people from Maclean's are going, you don't understand, from Quebec, saying, you don't understand us at all. You guys just don't get it. And we don't know why we're here, and they're sitting around a table at dinner, and this Quebec woman, or this Canadian woman who's sort of a peacemaker-y kind of person, she's going, well, I guess I don't get it, so tell me more, so does this really listening thing. And after 20 minutes or half an hour of that, the Quebec woman goes, if this is possible, anything's possible. She's had a breakthrough in emotion. She's been heard, and it's just a revelation for her. And the next morning she goes to the Indigenous woman and says, tell me what it's like for you. And the Indigenous woman pours out this. So in the meantime, Fisher has been going over all the chart pads from the previous discussions. He thinks it's coming apart, and he's trying to pull together something that they might be able to work on from all the chart pads. So there's a way in which he's doing the head work and the women are doing the heart work, and that comes together on Sunday. And suddenly they're all on the same page, and they get together and are editing the thing that he's provided. And they come up with these, 4 pages of parchment colored paper, their vision for Canada with all their John Hancocks at the bottom of it, and everybody's hugging each other, and it's just like, whoa. And what it did, and I have a whole page analyzing this. I hired a investigative reporter to go and interview people from this thing. 10 years later, I managed to catch up to this, and but he found out that that they only thought of it as a focus group. They didn't think of it as a democratic innovation, so they didn't do it again. But what happened was all sorts of conversations happened all over Canada about it. There was a vicarious experience by the Canadian people. Oh, they also had a hour-long public affairs program, because the whole thing was videoed. So they did a public affairs program showing it in video, moment by moment. And so this vicarious experience, which none of us actually ever have with these things, is they're suddenly the whole country is engaged. There's a kind of we the people has been born, and they want answers, getting talk shows and pulling in politicians and all the rest. And it's like the politicians get it that there's something going on, and they sort of put oil on the water so it didn't. But if Maclean's had done it again, it's like having one election. You don't have one election, you have elections every couple of years. It's like if Maclean's had done it every year and made it into an institution, the people who were picked next would have looked at what happened last year and say, hey, what's going on here? And it would have, the feedback loop with the larger population would have been fed. So I look at that as a systemic, brilliant.
Yeah,
we could do that. Any country or city could do that, something like that.
A couple things stand out for me about how the breakthrough was achieved. It was women over dinner, which I think is where a lot of breakthroughs happen if there's a diverse group of people doing the discussing. So, I want to know, I'm always like, okay, now what do we do with this? Now what do we do with this? And so I'm wondering if you, What are the applications that you envision for this country at this time on this planet? Like, I want to talk about where the rubber meets the road, and how do we actually make this worthwhile? I mean, it's already worthwhile, but how do we scale it? I'm not even sure I'm asking the right question, but I'm thinking about the war in Ukraine and wondering, how do we apply this to that?
Well, first of all, that's an example when it's like with climate change, things have gone a little far off the rails already. And yes, there are levels, but it requires much higher level of expertise to do something when things have gone way off the rails. But there's much to talk about on that. And in terms of the generic, let's get a bunch of citizens together to discuss a shared social issue of some kind, that there's hundreds of those things that have gone on around the world, and particularly in Europe. Extinction Rebellion in UK demanded that one of their demands was that there be a declaration of a climate emergency and then a citizen assembly on climate emergency. And England did that, and then a bunch of districts in England did that, and it spread to France has done one, and Austria has done one. There's a lot of experimenting going on, and people who are studying that experimenting. So it's developing as a whole field of how you do these. And there's an emergent inquiry, which I am part of, which is how do these things actually serve systemic transformation? It's one thing to get policies that are more narrow, but that don't look at, like you look at climate. Okay, so how do we get to our goals by 2030 or something is one thing, but where did climate change come from in the first place?
Yeah,
the roots of it. And that's what we're now exploring, is to up the possibility, both what happens in the room when the people are there deliberating, and where that whole deliberation is placed in the system. Because, for example, governments aren't likely to do major changes that change their power structures. So what's the use of these?
I see glimmerings of just the beginnings of that sort of global conversation at the IPCC, where they have to reach some kind of consensus, the governments and the scientists who are creating the report. And more, the global victims of climate change, which at this point are mostly in the global South, are starting to really raise their hands and say, no, we need a different way of deciding this. Right. And it's just the very beginning, but I don't think they're thinking anywhere near with the kinds of holism that you're offering yet.
Yes. Yeah. But there's another thing that's also emerging simultaneously, which a colleague of mine noticed was happening with nobody organizing it, with all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is that the stakeholders involved in each of those Sustainable Development Goals are coming together in networks, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-scale networks to try and get something to happen on that Sustainable Development Goal, which is different from the citizen approach. But if you define democracy as those who are impacted by a decision should play a role in making the decision, that's stakeholders fit that perfectly. Not all of them are ideal. There's a lot of ones that are lopsided towards governments or multinational corporations, but there's more and more experimenting going on, and inclusive, balanced, the whole picture sort of things I write about ideally are now starting to happen with nobody organizing it. And the fact that they do not have the technologies of dialogue and deliberation available to them is a tragedy, but it's a high leverage thing to start helping them organize to be able to hear each other and co-create something together. If all the parties that are involved in creating the problem in the first place can actually work out something where they're no longer creating the problem, they're creating something that actually functions, that's a big step. So
yeah. So I see there aren't any questions in our Q&A yet, so I want to invite people to put those in there. And in the meantime, if it's okay with Gail,
I'll start. I was going to start out with a question to get us rolling, and hope that somebody pops in a question. Sometimes it takes a little time for people to think about it. So Tom, I believe that you gave this very lofty perspective of things about wisdom and deep thinking and deep learning and all those sorts of things. I wonder, I'm a dean at a graduate school, and I worry about how to instill those sorts of concepts into students today. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't know, because I'm neither an academic nor a curriculum designer. But a lot of the things where citizens are being picked at random are can be applied in schools. I know that one of the most powerful forms of problem solving and deliberation are too inadequate for. It's problem transformation and conflict transformation. It uses a process called dynamic facilitation, which is heavily uses reflective listening to transform the people who are involved, and they come up with group ahas, breakthroughs. But you can do that with students. You could do that with a situation in the campus, which of course you can get in trouble for doing, but or you can do it for larger concerns. If they have justice concerns, they have climate concerns or concerns about AI or something, you could give them the job of trying to do that and trying to come up with something together. And I actually have I have an idea for an online game that nobody's picked up on so far, but where there's competition between groups who are trying to resolve, okay, so we're going to do climate change. So you get to pick how diverse your group is. A whole pile of people have written where they are politically. And if you have a bunch of progressives on it, you don't get many points for coming up with an agreement at the end. But if you have a progressive and a Trump supporter and a regular conservative and a green and a libertarian, and you end up coming up with something that has 80 or 90% agreement, you get a lot of points for that. And the teams compete for who can get the largest points. So that's have an online, I have a structure for how you do it, how you would actually do the deliberation. But the use of that first thing on the list, the diversity plus good process, and it's not just hearing each other. In the United States, there's a movement that's generally called bridging. The people who are bridging between left and right, the blues and the reds, and there are dozens of organizations that are doing that work. But the people who finally succeed in hearing each other across those divides, and suddenly they're humans to each other, they can respect the other's viewpoint even if they disagree. They come up and they go, what now? What's next? And the idea that they can actually work on issues together and come up with quote unquote bipartisan. I always think bipartisan is too small a target. We want to have transpartisan, multipartisan, beyond partisan. But having, to the extent that these people, these students, can experience what it's like to use their diversity and their disturbances between them, that's using diversity and disturbance creatively pattern, the extent they can actually experience what that's like, they are taking a step towards that wisdom. But you could also, ideally, you would also have them, studying some of those systems or holistic sciences, ecology, complexity science is like really important. The idea that you have there's a thing, I can't remember the name, it's a quadrant model that has simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And it's points about how simple is simple linear causality. You have a linear cause. Here's one from here to here, linear cause. You can learn how to do that well. And complicated is lots of linear causal connections. And complex is where there's lots of causal connections, but they're all dancing together. Everything is dancing with each other. You have to be part of that dance, that relationship, to deal with complexity. You can't solve complexity. You can solve simplicity, but you can't solve complexity. The whole problem-solving framework is problematic. So that's like trying to solve climate change. No, you go for the basics, figure out how you are part of the creation of this and start to do that kind of transformational work in yourself and in the systems you're part of. That's a wisdom task, and complexity science helps that, helps understand that a lot. So there's all of the things are resources for getting more wisdom, but having the simplest and most accessible is just having whatever diversity is in the room, find something they disagree with, and then apply good process to a microcosm of them and have everybody watch what happens.
Sounds good, Tom. Thank you. Thank you. That was very useful. One short question and then another question. Donna Williams says, I've read Tao of Democracy. I'm a fan. And if I were to read a second book of yours, which one would you hope I read next?
Well, if democracy is your thing, then Empowering Public Wisdom, which unfortunately is out of print. It's the only one that got done through a publisher. And after a year, they took it out of print. So you have to get used copies wherever you can. But that is sort of an updated, it's a more current kind of version of what the Tao of Democracy, which is its 20th anniversary this year. So I would recommend that. If you are into sustainability kinds of issues, I would say Participatory Sustainability, which is a short book, but it's like you cannot get sustainability without mass participation. And it has to be the right kind of mass participation. And this talks about all the different ways to do that, to bring wisdom into the sustainability challenge. And I gather that, I imagine there's a lot of both scientists and religious people who are into that frame of reference. My favorite other book would be the Reflections on Evolutionary Activism, which is, I was working with Michael Dowd, who I don't know if he's a member of IRAS or has been a member, but he's right in that same domain. The connection of his book, the Thank God for Evolution, it's like God is reality. And if you don't get right with God, you're going to be screwed over. So he's totally grounded in science, but from a spiritual perspective. And I became enamored with his and his wife's work, but they don't cover activism. And I'm an activist to my core in the sense of what's going on in the world has something to do with me, and I need to take action on that. And if I'm taking action on changing things that are not healthy, I am being that piece of evolution working on that. Whenever the whole has something that's not fitting, it generates dynamics to address that for healing or transformation or both. And so activism, I began to look at activism as a way of living evolution, and taking that as a spiritual thing. If we are evolution becoming conscious of itself, that has a 13, 14 billion year history. We are not alone. We are not isolated. We are participating in activity that has a, this is what the Big Bang looks like now. It's like the wow kind of stuff now. What does it mean for how we actually do our activism? And there's a whole different way to think about activism in that book, or being a change agent of any kind. So I don't know, it depends on what you're interested in. All my books are great, but you might also, if you don't want to, you can go short, you can not have to read a whole book. I have lots of writings, and the ones that are curated on the co-intelligence.institute website provide a very concentrated sense of the kinds of things that I write, and there's pieces on democracy there too. But my democracy work is very centered in process and getting sophisticated about how to think about process, how to think about what constitutes generative interaction between people. Because if we want we the people to come up with wisdom, we have to attend to the processes that we're using with we the people.
And that next question is kind of a broad question. It's from Paul Carr. How do we reduce the increasing political polarization in the US? Party has become more important than country.
Okay. There are you can look for the Bridge Alliance. And among the Bridge Alliance is an alliance of people who are working on this kind of bridging to deal with polarization. And the one that I know best out of that, which is, very large initiative, called Braver Angels. It used to be called Better Angels from Lincoln's thing about better angels of our nature. But it's Braver Angels for reaching across the divides. And it's pretty equally divided between what they call the reds and the green, the reds and the blues, the left and the right. And these are people who came together from these different places in the spectrum to hear each other. And there's various practices that they have to help people listen. And among those practices that is most potent is reflective listening. There's another very interesting one that I just got trained in to see what it was like. What is it called? It's not collective vision, it's another vision. I could probably find out if he wants to drop me. Anybody can write me at cii@igc.org if you have a separate question or want a reference. But their approach is using texting. You are given, once you've been trained in their method, you are given 100. You aren't given them they have a system, an electronic system, which sends a text message to 100 text sources, phone numbers in an area that's primarily red, because most of the people who are doing it are in the blue, the liberal kind of category. And you get when people start responding, then you are able on the system, you never see their phone number, but you are on the system, you can respond to them and they can respond to you. You can start conversations, and you're basically trying to understand them, really understand where they're at and let them know that you have heard them. There's no convincing going on. And this activity has reached tens of thousands of people already over the last year or two. And it's another very intriguing initiative. There's technologies of conversation and listening for what to do about that. And various people are doing it at various levels. It's not something we just turn off, partly because it's being used. It's being used by all political factions to generate hatred of the other political factions. And, we can only do so much from the ground up to deal with that. But there's lots of people who are doing good work in that area and could use support and participation.
Great, thank you. So the next is a kind of series of comments by Elizabeth Bjorkman. I'll summarize them. Basically, she's talking about term papers and how a lot of times there are a lot of conclusions, but there aren't a lot of questions at the end that say where they should go. So she's asking, and I'll read this part. I guess I'm asking for professors to encourage students to sometimes write term papers which generate more questions versus answers. And I think she's waiting for you to comment on that.
Well, again, I don't live in that particular world, but one of the patterns in the Weiss-Moxie pattern language, wd-pl.com, is powerful questions. There is actually a whole science and art of creating questions that generate change. And the main branch of that is called strategic questioning. And one of the best strategic questions I've ever seen was at the beginning of a conference. There was a World Cafe, a sort of discussion-based phase, where it was, the question that was given was, what question, if we address it really well here, would make all the difference in the world? It's like suddenly everybody's talking about that with each other. So I would say, I mean, I don't know what I'm talking about here, but I would imagine that trying to say, after you do your paper, what questions should somebody pursue to find out more about this that would make a difference, or something like that, to create a question about questions, specifically about whatever the assignment is, and directing it towards possibilities. You know, I don't know if that would work, but what do you think? Do you think that would work? You work with students.
I do. I think it does sound interesting. I think it's a good approach.
Give it a try.
Yeah, we will. Last question is from Maynard, and Maynard's just going to get on and ask it himself.
Okay.
Well, it's not so much a question as thank you, Tom and JD, for this discussion. I was reminded at Star Island last week, we were ending up the whole series of presentations on the climate crisis, looking for seeds of hope. And we heard a compelling presentation by Dr. Francis Flannery at James Madison University. JD, you will remember this, and the kind of response that we got from the participants in the conference. And she has a website called bioearthcommunity.com. So I wanted to just comment that this allows for an opportunity for somebody to sign on and sign the peace pledge, which is which Dr. Flannery has composed. It's a simple kind of thing. I think it's important. I'm a believer in the sandpile theory of social change. Lots of people, whatever the issue is that we want to engage in, lots of people have been working on this issue before us. None of us are in a position to make any impact by reinventing the wheel. What we need to do is to join the thousands of persons that Tom has referred to as all through this presentation, who are working on these issues, because you never know, when you join the movement, there's never any way to anticipate the final grain of sand on the sand pile that starts the avalanche. You might be that grain of sand that that precipitates the movement that can make the difference in the world. And this website that Dr. Flannery has initiated, bioearthcommunity.com. It's very simple to remember. Sign on and join the movement, and you will be right there with Tom and all the others who have gone before and are working on these issues. So that's my comment. I want to thank you again, Tom. Thank you, JD. Thank you, CJ, for your work behind the scenes. Thank you, Gail, for for moderating this important session. So thanks to all of you too who have joined us this afternoon for this presentation. You are very important as we move forward in these days ahead on all of these issues that we raise in these webinars. This one will be linked on our website. maybe as JD said earlier, within a week, maybe earlier, maybe by the weekend. So you can go to iras.org and just follow the prompts and look at some of these slides again that Tom has offered today, with lots of resources with which you can engage.